Hello, this is Jerry Mitchell. We are back from our episode of Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have ICE agents were directly told to violate the Constitution, and the agency tried to hide that fact, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Immigration Pathways subreddit. And yeah, it looks like some kind of TikTok video or something of some guy saying that, and it's then they have here's a source. It's some AP News article. And yeah, personally, I don't think any federal agency should be violating the Constitution. But the federal government always tries to find a way around the Constitution wherever possible. And oftentimes Reddit doesn't care. Reddit only cares since the outgroup's in power currently. Whenever the in-group's in power, they always sweep any and all constitutional violations under the rug or attempt to justify them. But the second the outgroup does the same thing, Reddit thinks that, the Constitution is the sacred holy document that can't be broken, even though they're completely fine with it being broken when the in-group is in power. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Section 122, the Trump administration's illegal stopgap, from Cato.org, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care about any illegal stopgaps, but ultimately, the government can justify whatever it wants to justify using whatever sections of legal code it wants to justify using it with, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't really matter what's written down on paper. It matters what those in power are willing to enforce. People, it might technically matter what's written down on paper, like they're apparently citing some legal section here of some legal document, but ultimately what's written down on paper is irrelevant. What matters is what those in positions of authority are willing to enforce. Next we have the problem of capitalism is that you eventually run out of things for the capitalists to steal, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a meme of, it looks like Margaret Thatcher, she says, the problem of socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Margaret Thatcher, head of a government mired in corruption, who not only sold off publicly owned institutions for the benefit of a privileged elite, but encouraged a culture of reckless stock market profiteering, which eventually caused the economy in such a way, right, that billions of pounds, such dollars of public money had to be spent to cover the mistakes of very rich people. The problem of capitalism is eventually run out of things for the capitalists to steal. And yeah, personally, I don't think capitalism is perfect, but I definitely do think it's probably the best system we have out of all of them. I think the libertarian position, if you want to do capitalism, you should be able to do capitalism. If you want to do socialism, you should be able to do socialism. If you want to do any system of government, communism, fascism, you should be able to do it as long as it's voluntary and not forced. The problem with socialism is that the socialists inherently want to use the state to enforce socialism, which is not libertarian, even though, they try and mark themselves as, a few of them at least, as quote-unquote libertarian socialists. But I would say the big problem with libertarian socialists is that 99% of them always put the socialist before the libertarian, despite, they always want to use the state to enforce socialism, and that's not very libertarian. You shouldn't use the state to enforce your ideology, be it economic, religious, cultural, etc., etc. Next we have, when business people run government, the government doesn't become a business, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, ultimately, I don't think it really matters who's running government. I think who's really running government are the deep state bureaucrats who are making day decisions in like the alphabet agencies like FBI, CIA, NSA, etc., etc. But ultimately, government is kind of, I would say the difference between the business and a government is that a business, you can always take your business to another business if you want to without leaving the country you're in. When it comes to government, you're stuck with whichever one your country you're in, and if you don't like it, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's why I think the libertarian position is we should probably arguably treat government more like business. Maybe, if the government's not working, people can get a different government without leaving their house. Maybe treat it like a streaming service. If you don't like government, if you don't like voluntary government A, maybe go over to voluntary government B. And that's how I think that's what the libertarian position is, I would say. Next we have, so apparently billionaires are bad now, posted by Gen Z Gingy, and that's a screenshot of a tweet from Tom Woods. The oldsters are going to give the youngsters more war and slavery if it's the last thing they do. Young people, the oldsters show up at the polls. This time you need to do likewise. You cannot let billionaires buy a congressional seat and put this ridiculous empty suit in it. And that was him, a screenshot of a tweet from KYO4 GOP primary results by age group, age 17-25, Massey plus 25, age 26-35, Massey plus 56, age 46-45, Massey plus 38, age 46-55, Massey plus 17. Then age 56 and up, it's almost all, it's age 56-65, Ed Gowering plus 18, age 66-75, Gowering plus 45, age 76 plus, Gowering plus 33. And yeah, personally, I just go to show you that, ultimately, the old people, social media is pretty much 100% for Thomas Massey, but cable news is pretty much all for Eld Gowering, and that it just goes to show you that, people are gonna believe whatever their media sources tell them. I think Massey's by far the better candidate, but ultimately, it does should depend on who shows up to vote, and oftentimes it is the old farts who get all their information from cable news who are the ones who are voting. And if Gowering does end up winning, I would just another case if that argument for that libertarian should be against democracy, because democracy is inherently forced collectivism, and it's treated like libertarianism, and libertarians like shit for years, and it's time we recognize that, democracy isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's inherently mob rule and tyranny of the majority, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have, I would never have guessed it was possible where a boy is all grown up, and it looks like a cross post that I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I was posted by FlimsyL563, by the way, and that was a screenshot I did of a tweet to Jeremy Coffin did. Cato's goal is to have every supermarket in America be full of aggressive schizo-Africans. Of course you're going to be mad when someone stands up to one, and I replied, one of the cardinal rules of libertarians is live and let live. If they aren't hurting anyone else, you shouldn't be picking fights with them. It's like how I don't care for Israel's role in the U.S. foreign policy, but I don't go bursting synagogues yelling about it. And the OP had, or at least expect to experience growth. Old timers here will get it. And yeah, personally, I don't really like how Jeremy Kaufman, who's also trying to dissolve the Libertarian Party, got into a fight with some schizo-African, as in his words, in the supermarket parking lot. If he wanted to get into a fight with him, I think he should have been able to, justify whatever he want to. But as long as he's not hurting anyone else, he should be allowed to do whatever he wants to, regardless of how schizophrenic it may look. And yeah, personally, maybe if Kaufman owned the supermarket that the parking lot the incident happened in, he might have a better case. But as it is currently, I personally don't think he's justified. If no one's being hurt and the NAP is not being violated, you shouldn't just go around picking fights with people. I think that's very much a libertarian position. Live and let live. If you want to justify picking fights with people, pick fights with whoever you want to. Just fight whatever you want to. But ultimately, you gotta live and let live. Focus on your own affairs first and foremost, rather than trying to police the whole world. And that's very much the libertarian ethos, I would say. Next we have Pete Hegseth can't explain why America needs a $1.5 trillion military budget from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be pumping $1.5 trillion into its military budget, but ultimately the U.S. can throw whatever, just like every other government, the U.S. can throw taxpayer dollars at whatever bullshit it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have a $1,700,000,000 fraud on the American taxpayer. Trump to drop IRS suit in exchange for MAGA slush fund from commondreams.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And just like the previous post, taxpayer dollars, I think it's interesting. They track every dollar that they get in, but they don't really track it nearly as hard as it goes out. So oftentimes, there's really nothing you can do about where your taxpayer dollars end up. And sadly, that's just how the world works. Next, we have Anyone Else, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a meme they did. Libertarian left wants surveillance and civil liberties, stop government spying, abolish mass incarceration, reform police power, protect digital privacy, social justice and personal freedom, LGBTQ plus race and equality, reproductive freedom, decriminalize and legalize cannabis, ending racial injustice, economy and workplace democracy, worker-owned cooperatives, democratic control of economy, unions and strong labor laws, universal health care, global relations and power, non-interventionist foreign policy, no military regime changes, global peace and solidarity, bottom-up power structures, and then they added, and when I say universal health care, I do not mean M4A, there were plenty of other models that work better for the U.S., specifically a modified Bismarck model similar to Japan, Germany, and South Korea use. And yeah, personally, I would agree with a decent amount of that. I might not agree with all of it, But, ultimately, I think libertarian positions, if you want to be a libertarian leftist or libertarian rightist, thinks that's fine, as long as you don't use the government to make people do things that they don't want to do. A lot of libertarian leftists do want to have forced government socialism, and I don't think that's very libertarian. Ideally, if you do want to do socialism, that should be voluntary. If people want to buy into your socialist model, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to do so if they don't want to. And that's that's where I think a lot of libertarian, quote unquote, libertarian socialists fall short. Next, we have the U.S. massacre of the Minab Girls Elementary School in Iran is the 6th largest massacre of school children in human history, from Wikipedia.org, posted by Gerber. And that's the Wikipedia page to the list of school massacres by death toll. And yeah, personally, I don't really care how the U.S. bombed girls' elementary school in Iran, but ultimately, Reddit only cares because the outgroup did it. It was happened under the outgroup's administration rather than the in-groups. The U.S. military bombed a hospital under Obama's administration. And now that kind of got memory hold, and Reddit thinks Obama was the greatest president ever. But in reality, it doesn't really matter who's the president. The U.S. is always going to be bombing people, sometimes accidentally bombing civilian targets, and there's nothing you can do about it. If this happens again under a Democrat, Reddit will probably sweep it under the rug. But, it doesn't really matter who's in power. The president's mostly just a figurehead. Who's really in control is the alphabet agencies and the military-industrial complex. Electoral politics is mostly just WWE to distract the Rubes and the Marks. Next, we have a North Carolina Goodyear plant is the latest victim of Trump's misguided tariffs and costly Iran war, from Reason.com, hosted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, sometimes plants are going to shut down because of bad government policy. But it's interesting how Reddit only ever pushes that as a result of bad Republican policy. Spirit Airlines just went bankrupt, and one of the big people who pushed for the blocking of the merger between Spirit and JetBlue, which probably would have saved both airlines because JetBlue's probably going to go bankrupt soon too, was Elizabeth Warren, a noted progressive who Redditors love. I think that's important to remember as well. Reddit only cares about pushing the screw ups of the out group. But whenever the in-group screws up, they always push it under the rug, sweep it under the rug. Next, we have the problem with socialism in practice is that you eventually run out of people who voluntarily support it, and that's a bunch of pictures of socialists in the streets, it looks like, and that was posted by USMCBF, and they added, "Stop pretending this isn't what it leads to, you know who you are." And I would agree with that. Socialism, if it's done voluntary, I think it can be okay. But in a lot of times, socialism, the socialists want to use the state to enforce their ideology, and that leads to all these pictures, like tanks in the streets and soldiers in the streets and the military and streets and all that, and that's all, and that isn't very libertarian, I would say. I would say socialists might argue, well, at least my intentions are good, and I would say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have Thomas Massey's enemies are attacking him with an unfair accusation, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the accusation is by some lady named Symphony West. I think that's bullshit. Especially since it's right before an election. She didn't come forward in the years before the election. She's just in the week or two before the primary election that it's between him and Ed Galbraith. And it just goes to show you that I remember a lot of people were saying "Me Too" and "Believe a Woman." This is what happens when people are just using that to kind of cheat and discredit all their opponents. If you want to believe a woman, that's fine. If you want to believe the accusation that against Thomas Massey, that's fine. But ultimately, when they happen to anyone who dissents whatsoever, eventually people are going to stop taking them so seriously. I'll say, and that's why I think it's kind of the death knell for Me Too. There are simply too many accusations against men. If we're up to the Me Too people, being a man would be illegal and you'd be thrown in prison for being a man. And it just goes to show you that it is important to hold sexual pest accountable. But when you claim everyone you don't like is a sex pest, people are going to catch on eventually. Next, we have "This Is Our Government," posted by Narco Federation, and that's a link to a tweet from the White House, iced out, and it's looks like Michael Jackson's glove, famous diamond stud glove with a MAGA necklace. And They added, and the OP added, using AI to twist Drake's latest album cover into fascist propaganda. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but I think libertarian positions, if they want to use AI for that, you should be able to use AI for whatever you want to. Like some tools, like guns or drugs, AI as a tool can be misused, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to do whatever you want with it, and that's very much the libertarian position. It's very much, it's guns, drugs, and abortions, justify doing whatever you want with them as long as you're not hurting anyone else, and some people think that, well, those inherently hurt other people, and my opinion is that, if you think that, that's fine, but you shouldn't be enforcing your will on other people. That's very anti-libertarian, don't enforce your will and values on other people. If they want to make an AI version of Drake's latest album into MAGA propaganda, they should be able to. If you don't like it, you're fine to say that, but, ultimately, it's still their justification of what they want to do with it, want to do with the AI. Next, we have Another Undeclared War from edition.cnn.com, posted by Austin Bicycle Tour, and that's an article, Exclusive CIA Escalates Secret War on Cartels with Deadly Operations Inside Mexico. And yeah, I personally don't care for that, but ultimately the U.S. government's has shown it's going to use military to screw around wherever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have, let's see, it's loading. The Constitutional Problem of Federal Immigration Power, posted by 8AF. And that's some paragraphs on, looks like the ruling in Xi Jinping versus the United States being one of the most controversially questioned Supreme Court decisions in American history. And important being that the Constitution was the federal government swiftly granted general plenary power over immigration. The unitary powers listed plainly regulate commerce, establish universal rule of naturalization, declare war, coin money, etc. But the Constitution never says Congress possesses unlimited authority to exclude or expel peaceful foreign persons simply because they are foreign. And then they added a few more paragraphs on that. And yeah, I personally think the libertarian position on immigration is, if you want to, if the state wants to justify cracking down on immigration, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, I think libertarian, if people do want to move around, I think they should be able to. But I definitely do think, you can have the welfare state and having free movement of people as well. I would say, especially when it's as easy on the welfare state as it is. When it's an illegal immigrant, it seems. And yeah, personally, I would say just move wherever you want to, but that doesn't entail you any additional benefits, I would say. And you do have some concerns over crime as well. A lot of illegal immigrants do commit a lot of crimes. I think that's important to remember as well, So ultimately, move wherever you feel like, but just be aware that when you move to another country, people might not like it, especially if you do so illegally. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have politician Mike Johnson says we need to let politicians trade stocks because they need the extra income, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Fluent in Finance subreddit. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't agree with that. But ultimately, if the politicians do want to trade stocks and they have the ability to do so, ultimately they're going to justify what they justify. I think personally, politicians shouldn't be paid a single cent from the American taxpayer, especially since our taxpayer dollars go to so much other bullshit. I think politics, especially at the federal level, it should be mostly volunteer work. If you want to do it, you should be able to. But that shouldn't entitle you to a salary from taxpayers, especially when our taxpayers' dollars go to so much other bullshit already. Next, we have Trump's Golden Dome estimated to cost $1.2 trillion, new report reveals from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I personally don't care for that, but if the U.S. government wants to throw $1 trillion at it, ultimately, there's nothing you can really do. As I said, pretty much everything else your taxpayer dollars go to. Your taxpayer dollars go to whatever bullshit the government wants, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have U.S. Congressman finally says the quiet part out loud, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the American Hard Mode subreddit. That's a tweet from Randy Fine. Deporting every single illegal is not enough, and paperwork doesn't make you an American. We must denaturalize and deport millions like Zoran Mamdani, who lied to gain citizenship, hates his country, and seek our destruction. The barbarians are inside the gate. And yeah, personally, Randy Fine is not someone I really care for how Zionist he is. But, ultimately, I do think he does have a decent point here. Ultimately, if America wants to deport people who are anti-American values like Zoran Mamdani, I personally wouldn't care for it. But, ultimately, you do have to keep your values somehow. And people like Zoran Mamdani are going to turn us into a woke, gay race communist state in the long run. So ultimately, I can see both sides here. If Americans are to keep their republic free. Well, it's not really a republic. It's the empire now, but it used to be the republic. If we are to ever restore the republic, we can't have woke foreign socialists in positions of power, like the mayor of some city in Southern California, I think, just got arrested of being a Chinese government asset. I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, I think, if I think the big problem is we live in forced collectives rather than a voluntary collective. You can't really kick people out without making it using the force of the government. Ideally, we'd have voluntary collectives. And if you want to ever kick someone out of your voluntary commune or whatever, you should be able to, as that's a private rather than public. I mean, that's ultimately the libertarian position. We got to privatize government rather than have these big, massive public governments. So when you kick people out for going against your values, at the very least you're not using the force of the state to do so. Next, we have Republican State Representative Justin Humphrey says it's not pedophilia. Parents have a right to marry off their underage children under parental rights, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Mayor McTee subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But Reddit, they just use their child marriage straw man meanwhile they justify anything that's marked as gender affirming care, be it top surgery or bottom surgery for minors, as long as they consent to it. And it just goes to show you they're hypocritical. If the minor does something that they want them to do, it's a right. But if minor does something they don't want them to do, like get married, it's pedophilia. And it's just to show you they don't care about pedophilia. They just use pedophilia as an attack. When it's the in-group, that when it's the out-group, they're pedophiles. When it's the in-group, they're minor attracted persons. And that just goes to show you that, they have no principles, only teams. They'll defend pedophiles in the in-group as minor attracted persons. They'll say, oh, they don't act on it, so it doesn't count. And it's just going to show you that, no values, only teams, as I say of pretty much every one of these podcasts. Next, we have Mike Johnson is a con posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a meme of Speaker that's Mike Johnson, who represents the 48th state. Just the congressman should be allowed to continue trading stocks because $174,000 salary is enough to live on. These people even hear themselves through their voters, and they link say source and link to YouTube video from Now This Impact News. It looks like. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, I don't think politicians should be trading stocks. I don't think they should be getting any money at all, personally. It should all be volunteer work, if you ask me. But, ultimately, if they want to justify trading stocks, ultimately, they that's going to be them, their justification to do so. Personally, I think even if you ban them from trading stocks, they'll just tell their friends and family instead, and they'll still find a way to get around it. And oftentimes, that's the problem with politics. Ultimately, all people are self-serving, and that includes politicians. I think if politicians do want to be self-serving, they should be able to. But, ultimately, all people are self-serving, and that's why, I personally don't really trust too many politicians, so especially those outside of Thomas Massey and maybe Rand Paul, because since they're inherently self-serving, they're just going to just use the state to grift as much as possible, and that's not something I particularly care for. Next, we have every rocket fired in Iran is money stolen from the American people, from thenation.com, posted by Woke Man. And I'd agree with that. Personally, I don't think we should be at war in Iran, but ultimately the U.S. is going to spend whatever it's taxpayer dollars and whatever bullshit it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And it looks like we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.